I don't know about you, but I like flipping that switch on and having the room light up. Paul said, this one thing I do. He set his heart on something spiritual, on serving the Lord. Carlyle said many years ago, find a worthwhile purpose and then throw all the weight of your being behind it. And this is what Paul said, just in another way. Back years ago, and again, those of you younger will not appreciate this like those who lived a generation ago might. But you see, years ago, we didn't have central heating and cooling. Oftentimes, buildings, be it a church building, a school, or other things, were heated by wood or by coal. And often it was the case that with a country school, boys would take turns and they would go in and they would fire up the heater early in the morning so that they would have the room warm when the other students came. Well, I want to tell you a true story about a man by the name of Glenn Cunningham. You see, it was time for Glenn and his younger brother to go in and light the furnace in the dead of winter and heat up the old country schoolhouse. Well, they went in, as the custom was, and they poured some kerosene in on the wood, and little did they know there was some embers still smoldering. When they poured that kerosene up, there was an explosion and a fire. Glenn grabbed his brother and dragged him to the door of the schoolhouse. And as he got him there, he fell out. He literally was unconscious. Neighbors saw the schoolhouse burning, and they ran to it, and they pulled the boys out. Glenn's brother was dead. And Glenn had been burned from the waist down. Very, very tragic. Now, what you don't know about young Glenn was the fact that he loved to run as a boy, as many boys do. He loved to race. He often would race his brother, and he would race the boys that he went to school with. And as a young boy, he had a worthwhile goal. He said, I want to break the record for running the mile. Now here is young Glenn. He has been burned from the waist down. The skin had been seared off of his body. His muscles had been cooked. His tendons were dehydrated. The doctor said to his parents, your son will not live. No chance. But you see, the doctors didn't reckon with the determination that this little boy had. And he not only lived for a week, but then a second week and a third week. And the doctor said, well, we were wrong. He's going to live, but Glenn will never walk. Because of the burns he suffered on his lower body. But Glenn told those doctors as he lay there in that hospital bed, I am going to break the record for running the mile. And I can just imagine, don't you know how they just smiled at him? Like, you poor child, you just don't know the shape you're in. Well, he continued to improve until he was able to go away from the hospital. He still wasn't able to walk. But he went home. At the age of 18, he still could not walk. His father was just a poor, as we would say back then, especially a dirt farmer. Before the days of tractors, he had his father tie his hands to a breaking turning plow and hitch up the horses or mules to it. And they literally would drag him around that big field, breaking up ground. And he was telling those muscles in his legs to move, to walk. The neighbors were ready to have his daddy horsewhipped until they realized that the boy was causing his dad to do this, that the boy was that determined. At the age of 22, he still couldn't walk well, but he could shuffle along without a cane or a crutch, and he went off to college. To make a long story short, at age 25, Glenn Cunningham broke the record for the 1 mile run. How did he do that? He had a purpose. He said, this one thing I'm going to do. I'm going to break the record for the 1 mile run. And he did. The doctor said he was going to die. He said, no, I'm going to break the record for the 1 mile run. He had a purpose. Just like the Apostle Paul, when he wrote those words by inspiration in the first century, Paul said, this one thing I do. There was a Navy pilot several years ago by the name of Lieutenant Commander Frank Ellis. He was flying his plane in on the West Coast, and as he came in, his control stopped functioning. He could not lift the nose of the plane. He was still a few miles from the airport with the runway, and he knew he couldn't make it. They were telling him on the radio to bail out. But as he started to pull that ejection handle on that plane, he looked ahead and he saw right there in front of him a mobile home park. And he knew if he ejected out of that plane plane was going to go straight into those mobile homes. And there were men and women and children there. And a lot of people would die. So using the seconds that he had left, he found that he still had enough control to where he could turn that plane. It was still going down, but he was able to turn and get it off of course with that mobile home park. When he ejected from that plane, he was only 65 feet high. And we've got some pine trees around here that are taller than that. That plane was traveling at over 160 miles an hour. When he ejected, he was thrown into a grove of eucalyptus trees. Now, just a few of his injuries. Both legs were broken. His right leg had to be amputated immediately. Both arms were broken. His back was broken. His neck was broken. 8 ribs were caved in and broken. 1 lung was punctured. He had a fractured skull and a brain concussion. That was just the more serious injuries. Because of infection, his remaining left leg would not heal, so it had to be amputated. Now he was a double amputee. As he recovered in the hospital, various ones came and they said, "What are you going to do, Commander? You're going to get out and the Navy's going to take care of you for the rest of your life." He said, "I'm going to fly for the U.S. Navy." And they laughed because they said, "No double amputee has ever flown for the United States Navy." He said, "I'm going to." After months and months, he was released from the hospital, and his back muscles were so weak he couldn't even sit up, much less stand upon any kind of artificial legs or with crutches or anything else. He began to exercise and build his muscles up. He knew he was going to have to prove himself. So when he got out of the hospital, he went to a private airport. He took flight lessons. He got his license to fly small planes. He went to the Pentagon and they said no. So he said, "I'm going to have to prove to them I can do everything that anyone else can do." So he took up water skiing, he took up skydiving, and after 4 trips to the Pentagon, again to make a long story short, Lieutenant Commander Frank Ellis was the first double amputee to fly for the United States Navy. Now what's the purpose of that story? You see, he had a goal. He said, "This one thing, I am going to fly again for the United States Navy." And he did. There is power in purpose. And you and I, we can apply that spiritually to our lives. This one thing I do. What if we set our goal as heaven? This one thing I do. I'm going to heaven. No one, not the devil himself, can stop us. 30 or 40 years ago in Dallas, Texas, a most unusual thing happened. It was Sunday night, denominational church building, big building, auditorium that would seat about 2,500 people. And there was a car salesman, and he was sitting there about midway back, and as the preacher was preaching, he was doing like we sometimes do. He began to kind of look around. He noticed there weren't but 400 or 500 people, and that big building looked empty.